réalité, c'est plus sophistiqué. On met en place des forces de réassurance, c'est-à-dire que...
Avec des soldats français, européens?
Il y a des soldats britanniques, français, turcs qui...
Vladimir Putin had red lines that he said would lead to doomsday if crossed. However, in the last quarter of 2025, these lines were not only crossed, they were virtually wiped out. French President Emmanuel Macron's latest statement had a chilling effect in the corridors of the Kremlin. Following the agreement, the security force unit is planned to be deployed to Kiev and Odessa. According to Macron, these forces will include British, French, and Turkish soldiers. Ankara immediately welcomed Macron's plan. The Turkish Ministry of National Defense stated that it is open to sending soldiers to Ukraine as part of an international mission. And NATO's 3 strongest armies are now taking action. For Putin, the war is not actually over. For Russia, the real strategic defeat is just beginning. So, how exactly will this guarantee force that is shaking the Kremlin operate on the ground? This is not an ordinary peacekeeping mission or a symbolic flag display. Current statements and intelligence reports indicate that the structure to be established on Ukrainian soil is designed to shut down any future Russian offensive capability, featuring a high-tech, multi-layered defense architecture. This volunteer coalition, formed by the UK, France, and Turkey, will be stationed away from the front lines but directly over Ukraine's lifelines. The first and most critical deployment area is the capital, Kiev, and its surroundings. The primary task here is to ensure the physical security of the Ukrainian government and guarantee the state's survival. However, from a military perspective, the French or British special forces stationed here will serve as a tripwire. According to this military doctrine, a single missile launched by Russia at Kiev or a single sabotage team sent by Russia would mean direct confrontation with the military of a NATO member country. This means that Putin's dream of regime change is gone forever. The most vital part of the operation, and the one that puts Russia in the tightest corner, is Odessa and the Black Sea coastline. Turkey's place in this equation, in particular, is a complete nightmare for Putin. This is where Turkey will bring its military and geopolitical weight to bear. The mission in Odessa is very clear: to keep the Black Sea trade routes open and to free the grain corridor from Russian blackmail forever. This mission, supported by the Turkish Navy and amphibious forces, will confine the Russian Black Sea fleet to its ports. Should Russia attempt any amphibious operation or naval blockade against Odessa, it will face NATO's second-largest army, the Turkish Armed Forces. This will be the moment when Russia's claim to the Black Sea as its Russian lake is consigned to history. The third, and logistically most critical layer, is the supply lines between Ukraine's western borders and the rear of the front. The UK's plan puts the size of the military force in concrete numbers. In the first phase, we are talking about a rotational force of between 5,000 and 10,000 troops, with a high level of readiness. According to Bloomberg and defence sources, London has already allocated more than £100 million for the logistical infrastructure of this operation. The most striking detail here is the presence of British engineering units. These units will not only house soldiers, but will also repair and protect Ukraine's railway and road network, which has been riddled with Russian missiles to NATO standards. With Russian railways teetering on the brink of bankruptcy and its own logistics crushed, this high-speed logistics corridor that the West will establish within Ukraine will guarantee an uninterrupted flow of ammunition and personnel to the Ukrainian army at the front. Russia's strategy of logistically strangling Ukraine has been shattered against the wall of British engineering and NATO funding. Perhaps the least discussed but most devastating element is the air policing mission. The deployment of British and French air forces to the region will create a de facto no-fly zone over Ukraine's western and central regions. This is a death sentence for Russia's long-range missiles and Iranian-made Shahed UAVs. Considering the tension created by UAV debris falling on the Romanian border, a scenario in which NATO radars and fighter jets protect Ukrainian airspace as if it were their own would wipe out Russia's terror bombing capacity. This system will enable factories, repair workshops, and training centers in western Ukraine to operate safely 24/7, transforming the war from a war of attrition into an industrial production race that Russia cannot cope with. But what if an agreement cannot be reached? and the winds at the White House change direction. If Washington cuts off support, saying, "This is not my war," will Ukraine collapse? No. On the contrary, a more ruthless, more localized, and more dangerous mechanism for Russia, namely the Syria Protocol, could come into play. We have mentioned that Turkey's place in this equation is critical. The US handing over security to Turkey while withdrawing from Syria was a preview of what will happen in Ukraine today. NATO's European wing and Turkey, the region's largest military power, will be eager to fill the void left by Washington. Look, Turkey's place in this security force equation is not a simple military miscalculation for Moscow, but a cause for geopolitical chaos. Because Turkey is not just any NATO member on the ground. Turkey is the only NATO army that holds the key to the Straits and has repeatedly humiliated Russian military doctrine on the ground over the past 5 years. The fear that Putin tries to hide behind friendly relations actually stems from Turkey's overwhelming superiority over Russian technology. As Ukrainian political scientist Petr Oleshchuk admits, Erdogan knows that Putin is weak. In this scenario, the division of labor is very clear and much more favorable for Russia. The US's most critical advantage for Ukraine is intelligence. If the US withdraws its NSA and satellite support, the stage is left to the British GCHQ and the Turkish MIT. Britain is the brain of Europe in electronic intelligence, SIGINT. Turkey is unrivaled in human intelligence, HUMINT, in the field. Turkey's seismic vessels, submarines, and UAV fleet in the Black Sea have the capacity to monitor every move and every radio communication of the Russian Black Sea fleet second by second and relay it to Kiev. The US satellites will be replaced by France's military observation satellites and Turkey's Göktürk systems. US arms support was also the most critical factor keeping Ukraine afloat, but this has been changing over the last 6 months. Without the US's massive ammunition stockpiles, the war will proceed with surgical strikes. As Europe's 2 nuclear powers, the UK and France have already crippled Russian logistics with the Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles they supplied to Ukraine. If the US withdraws, the Washington pressure on these countries will also be lifted. This means that the range restrictions on the missiles provided to Ukraine will be gone. Air bases deep inside Russia can now be targeted with the approval of London and Paris. And Turkey. The Turkish defense industry is a fast and deadly supply chain that is not held back by the bureaucracy of the US Congress. The Akinci and potential KAAN fighter jet collaborations, which will be added to the Bayraktar TB2s, will transform Ukraine from being dependent on the US into a regional production hub. The US gives fish, while Turkey teaches how to fish, produce armed UAVs. This is a never-ending nightmare for Russia. Another option is the Syria model, military pressure and a safe zone. Remember, when the US withdrew from northern Syria, chaos was expected on paper. But Turkey filled that void with its own military power and created a de facto safe zone. The same model is on the table for southern Ukraine. Even if the US withdraws, the Turkish Navy's Barbaros shield is enough to close the waters off Odessa to Russian ships. Turkey, Britain, and France could create a de facto buffer zone in southern Ukraine, just as in Syria, where Russia's entry would be considered a casus belli, cause for war. This would be a physical and diplomatic wall against the advance of the Russian army. Conventional warfare aside, Turkey has an asymmetric trump card that Russia can never possess, one even more dangerous than nuclear weapons: the Crimean Tatars. Putin believes he has turned Crimea into a fortress, an aircraft carrier. However, Ankara has thousands of Trojan horses living within the walls of that fortress. This issue is not just a human rights issue, it is a military sabotage strategy. In recent months, we have seen Russian officers' cars blown up in Crimea, railways sabotaged, and ammunition depots reduced to ashes by mysterious fires. The signature behind these actions is the Atesh movement. This underground network, formed by Crimean Tatars and Ukrainian partisans, is crippling Russia's control over the peninsula. Turkey's role at this point is critical. Crimean Tatars see Turkey as a historical elder brother and protector. Even if US support is withdrawn, the logistical, communication, and strategic support that Turkey's intelligence agency, MIT, can provide to these resistance cells could turn Crimea into a hellhole for Russian military forces. While Turkey exerts diplomatic pressure at the negotiating table, it is the spiritual and operational patron of this invisible army on the ground. Russia can fight an army in Crimea, but it cannot fight a ghost enemy living in its own cities, its own markets, right next to its own military bases. Turkey's persistent stance on the Crimean Tatars and its constant raising of this issue on international platforms renders Russia's annexation illegitimate forever. If the US leaves, Turkey will play the Crimea card more aggressively. Mobilizing the Tatar diaspora and fueling civil disobedience within Crimea will undermine Putin's "Crimea is Russian" thesis from within. While Russian soldiers fight the Ukrainian army on the front lines, they will know they are sitting on an ethnic bomb, ready to explode at any moment. This strategy is a full-scale strangulation operation. Whether Washington is involved or not does not change this equation. It only changes the form of the end that Russia will face. If the US withdraws, the war will not end. The war will turn into a more local, more complex, and more intractable quagmire for Russia. Against this tense diplomatic backdrop, the statement from Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov is the greatest proof of how much trouble Putin is in. Peskov said that the Turkish side continues to offer its services, and we are grateful to our Turkish friends for this. We are ready to provide all the conditions for the continuation of the negotiation process. Consider, the same Turkey, one of the main actors in Macron's peacekeeping force, is implementing policies that cut off Russia's energy pipeline and is strengthening a military coalition against Russia in the Black Sea. Despite all this, the Kremlin says it is grateful to Turkey. This is a cornered man begging not to lose his last diplomatic channel. Putin is so dependent on Turkey's mediation role that he has to turn a blind eye to all of Ankara's strategic moves. And Putin's fear regarding Turkey is not unfounded. History is littered with ruins that justify this fear. Let's refresh our memories. When Ankara overturned the chessboard in the Mediterranean with the agreement it signed with the Tripoli government in 2019, it faced Russia-backed Haftar and the Wagner mercenaries behind him. Russia had deployed its invincible Pantsir S-1 air defense systems to the field. The Kremlin believed these systems would hunt down Turkish UAVs like flies. However, the result was a complete disaster. Turkish Bayraktar TB2s hunted down the Pantsir systems, the pride of Russian technology, one by one. Russia's dream of establishing influence in the Mediterranean was blasted under the precision-guided munitions of Turkish armed UAVs. Turkey won the proxy war. Russia turned billions of dollars worth of equipment into scrap. Then came Syria. The Assad regime, believing itself untouchable under Russia's S-400 umbrella, was introduced to the Turkish army's Operation Spring Shield. Turkey blinded the Russian air defense network with its electronic warfare capabilities and UAV swarms. Russian-made tanks, armored vehicles, and those infamous air defense systems learned the hard way what a conventional army can do with modern technology. Putin was forced to negotiate with Ankara to stop the war he lost on the battlefield at the negotiating table. This was the moment when the limits of Russian military power were drawn, and the biggest blow landed in the Caucasus, Russia's backyard. The Karabakh issue, which Russia had frozen for 30 years, was resolved in 44 days thanks to Turkey's military doctrine, training, and technological support to Azerbaijan. Turkish armed UAVs systematically destroyed the Russian T-72 tanks and S-300 systems that formed the backbone of the Armenian army. The result? Russia's monopoly power in the Caucasus collapsed. Turkey sat at the table as an equal partner, and Russia was forced to share the role of peacekeeper. And note that all these processes were unfolding according to Trump and Putin's behind-the-scenes plans. Putin's friendly relations with Erdogan were based on necessary interests: access to the Mediterranean, passage through the Black Sea, and the equation extending from the Caucasus to Syria. In fact, all of this was based on Turkey's energy dependence. However, Trump and Erdogan's geopolitical and energy chess game is unraveling this dependency stitch by stitch. Half of Putin's geopolitical power was based on energy blackmail. By making Europe dependent on Russian gas, he wanted to break the West's will to impose sanctions. Russia also saw Turkey as its most important energy gateway and a lever it could use against the West. However, Turkey is quietly and resolutely taking away Putin's biggest trump card. News from Nordic Monitor reveals that Turkey's efforts to reduce its dependence on Russian oil, natural gas, and nuclear energy are gaining momentum. What is the catalyst for this change? US pressure. That's how it's being presented, but in reality, there's a chess game being played behind the scenes. After President Trump imposed comprehensive sanctions on Russian oil giants, he called on President Erdogan at a meeting at the White House to reduce oil and natural gas imports from Russia. This diplomatic pressure yielded immediate results. Turkish refineries sharply reduced their purchases of Russian crude oil. Instead, supply routes were shifted to non-Russian producers such as Iraq and Kazakhstan. This means that Turkey is now willingly breaking free from Putin's economic shackles. Turkey is no longer relying on Russia's cheap oil and gas. On the contrary, it is declaring its strategic independence. Turkey now sees improving relations with the US and the West as much more important and profitable than its dependence on Russia. What is Russian propaganda doing in response to these diplomatic and military moves by the West? A Russian propagandist cannot hide his delight, saying that the West has been persuaded to consider Russia's crazy peace agreement. However, they later admit that Russia will continue the war after the agreement. This is a mine planted right at the heart of the peace process. Russia sees any peace agreement as merely a pause, a breather, to rearm and attack again. This admission means that the Russian people see that their leaders are focused not on peace, but only on war. All diplomatic efforts are merely a tactical maneuver for the Kremlin. So, what are Ukraine and the West doing? They are also aware of this trap. The US-backed peace plan is being rewritten with this situation in mind. While the original plan limited Ukraine's peacetime military strength to 600,000 soldiers, the revised plan increases this number to 800,000. This is not a peace plan, but a plan to prepare for future war. Even if Ukraine signs a peace agreement, it knows that Russia will attack again, and is therefore ensuring that it maintains its maximum military capacity. This move also effectively invalidates Putin's goal of ending the military operation and disarming Ukraine. In summary, Macron's diplomatic move, combined with Turkey's strategic determination, has fundamentally shaken the Russian doctrine that Vladimir Putin has been trying to protect for years. The issue now under discussion is not whether NATO will come to Ukraine, but whether NATO's 3 key members will settle in Ukraine under the name of the Intergovernmental Assurance Force. So, what are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us.